Hi, I'm Rick Anthony, and welcome to the Someone You Should Know podcast, the podcast that focuses on musicians, authors, and interesting people. We like to say we're making a difference one artist at a time. So sit back, have a cold one, and get ready to meet someone you should know. It's Radio Brother time once again on the Someone You Should Know podcast. And not only is he a Radio Brother, but he's a radio historian. His Images of America series book called Chicago's WLS is an all-time favorite of mine. It's in my collection. It's so dog-eared, I think I have to get another copy of it. Will you please welcome the man, the myth, the legend, my friend, Scott Childress. How you doing, bud?
Hey, Rick. It's so glad to be here. And before we get started, I just want to congratulate you on the podcast. I cannot believe how much this has taken off. And,
I can't either, Scott. You know, if we would have had these numbers when I was on air, I think I'd be making $1 million.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
Scott, first off, I got to ask you, when did your love affair with Chicago radio begin? Where did you grow up?
So I grew up on the north side of the city, Foster and Western, in the Lincoln Square neighborhood. In the 70s was when my affair with radio started. Obviously, we had so much great radio to listen to here in the 70s and 80s. And I wanted to be an architect originally, Rick, and I loved the architecture. I still believe that Chicago has the best architecture of all the cities. But when I got to high school, I realized that I couldn't really handle that math. Nowadays that's all done with computers and CAD and things like that. But in the end, I realized it was the design that I liked as much, rather than trying to figure out how to make this beam meet this girder and things along those lines. Yeah. So, but what really I think made it go forward was when my parents were divorced and we moved to the suburbs. And now we didn't move very far, but we went from the north side to the west side, and it was just before high school. So all my friends were going to different high schools, and I was out in a new area, new neighborhood with people I didn't really know yet. However, the thing that was the same and that did go with me were all my friends on the radio, like Bob and Tommy and Larry and Jeff, and the music that went along with it. And I realized just how much I enjoyed music, and that's pretty much where that took off. And as a result, when I did make new friends, finally, we started to play radio at home, because what maybe a lot of people don't know who aren't in the business is that back in those days, we would put together tape recorders and microphones we could get from Radio Shack, and we would imitate our favorite radio stations.
That is so true.
Radio announcers.
That is so true. I did the same thing, exactly the same thing.
And at the time, it seemed so strange, and you didn't want to tell people about it because they'd think you're nuts or you're some weirdo or something like that. But think about now, Rick, what we did back then, and, I still have so many of those tapes that were from the 1980s where we played radio, and, we used the WLS call letters because I could tape the jingles off the air, things like that. But nowadays, these kids can do that and actually have an audience, not just into a tape deck and give it to their friends that are just 2 or 3 people. And the technology has changed so much. Look at how we're communicating today. That we're both coming into one location from miles and miles and miles away, and it's just as easy as just hitting a couple buttons on your computer.
Gosh, that's strange. It's the exact same story. I mean, I did the same thing. I had an old Lloyd's tape recorder. I graduated up to a Panasonic one year. That was really cool. But
the turning point for our little radio station was when Christmas came along, and I got the Radio Shack stereo disco mixer.
Oh, there you go. Oh, gosh.
The whole thing changed.
Actually, for us, it was my buddy was in the other room on an intercom. We had a Radio Shack intercom. That was our phone line. That's
a great idea.
He got to play all the different voices on the phone line, and that's how we did it, because you got that kind of almost like a tinny sound, which is ideal for phones and everything like that. So we were doing Boogie Check and all the other stuff Landecker was doing. I mean, that was just
and it's funny when you think about that the innovations that you come up with as kids, and then we end up using later on. A case in point, I remember one year, it was me and a couple of the buddies, and we were going to do a live broadcast from one of the the summer fairs that was close by. And I started thinking about, well, obviously we can't do that technically as live back to my house into a tape recorder. So we went out with a portable tape deck and we recorded all the segments, and then I brought them back and mixed them in as if they're live. And I think about it now, that's pretty much how voice tracking remotely works nowadays. And radio remotes in a lot of cases when you're out and about at the car dealer or at the bank or wherever. It's pretty much the same thing.
Very much so, very much so. Let's talk a little bit about your career. You attended Columbia College. Where'd you go after Columbia College, after you graduated?
So my first radio job after Columbia College was at a company called PIA. It was the PIA Radio Network, and they were a radio syndicator. So they were responsible for making sure that radio stations stayed legal because during deregulation, one of the things that changed is stations were not required to have somebody on board for several things, whether it was in the public affairs department. A lot of them, since news requirements had dropped, they really started to drop their staffs. And this company was put together to come up and create public affairs programming, so that you could run that on Sunday mornings. And the wrinkle is that they put all of the public affairs programming together, and then they bartered it. So your station would get it for free, but there would be commercials in there that the company had already sold. So I had worked there helping in the editing department originally. Then I was an assistant production director there, and I was there about 2.5 years. And the company also did a lot of play-by-play. So I got some of my first experience board opping, really, because we would record some of the guests that would come in. We would also record the announcers who would do the shows, the voiceover portion, and then we would do these live football and basketball broadcasts for Northwestern that came out of there. So there was a lot of activity that was going on there. And later on, several of the writers that I worked closely with ended up forming their own company, which is still together today, and that is Media Tracks, who does the same thing. They still do the public affairs and the healthcare shows, and they are out of Des Plaines, and they've been dear friends for many, many years. But that was the first off-air job I had, and then my first on-air job was part-time at a radio station in Joliet, Illinois, and that was 93.5 WJTW, which was a light hit station, was the term they called it at that point. So I worked generally Saturdays and Sundays there. I did some fill-in as well, and that got everything started for me, both off the air and on the air, prior to going into radio traffic reporting, which came pretty shortly after that.
I love that idea, too. It's really strange. Once again, background's kind of parallel. I was with the All-Star Radio Network for 19 years, and this program here, the Somebody You Should Know program, was part of basically it was part of a thing we called Network 15, where we sold out 4 slots of 15 minutes that would be used on the weekend as filler for public affairs content and such. And the Somebody You Should Know program came from that, and it was on about 300 stations back in the day. And when I retired, I asked my old boss, Ron Stevens, who ran All-Star Radio for so many years, I said, can I have the title? Can I use that Someone You Should Know program? Because by all means, go ahead. So this is a revitalization of something that I did on air, I should say on the network for, 5-6 years or something like that, back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And it's strange reconnecting with people and such like that. And it's, let's say, once again, jobs kind of parallel. Now, here's something that you did that I didn't do, is something we're going to talk about next, is you got a chance to be on the air and in the air at the same time. Two of my favorite things to do. You're a traffic reporter, and I know you've got some unusual stories about that. Let's talk about your time on the air and in the air.
Sure. So when I was at the PIA Radio Network, like I said, I was working as a production assistant there. I mean, it was first job out of school. I think I was making like $13,000 a year, which at that point in the mid to late 80s was unbelievable, So I was happy about that. But it really wasn't what I wanted to do exactly. You know what I mean? And it's like, I wanted to be on the air. And I remember when I first got my chance to be on the air at JTW, that was really what I wanted to do. But I didn't know how I wanted to go about it. I wasn't ready to leave Chicago. It was my hometown. And at the time, I was with a longtime girlfriend. She was still going to school. And that was not something that was in the cards yet. So one day, I happened to see this little blurb believe it or not, in the newspaper, either the Sun-Times or the Tribune. I don't remember which. And it said, radio traffic reporters wanted, starting new service. Please send your resume to blah, 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 blah. And it was Metro Networks. Now, here in Chicago, we always had shadow broadcast services. Shadow traffic was the huge service here in Chicago. However, outside of Chicago, the huge service was Metro. And later on, I had found out that the owners of both companies, so David Saperstein, who is the owner of Metro Networks, and Gary Lee, who is a dear friend of mine now, who was with Shadow, they had a gentleman's agreement that they stayed out of each other's hometown. So Metro was based in Texas, so they stayed out of Houston, and obviously with Shadow being in Chicago, well, one of them blinked and ended up going into the other, and I think it was Shadow going into Houston, so Metro said, we're coming here. And I remember our first traffic office was probably about the size of a bedroom. That was it. And we had, at the time, when I went there, we had 3 stations, I believe they had started with. So they started with a printer feed for Q101. And then, so they just sent them a feed of the traffic information that was generated on site by traffic producers. And then our other stations were the Spanish stations, that was WOJO, and at the time, WIND, and then WFYR, which was 103.5. That we did have a full traffic report person that was in the air. His name was Major Tom Johnson. And when they hired me, I sat at the desk and did a lot of producing, but they said, well, we're going to use you on the air as soon as we get more stations, so on and so forth. And my opportunity came to fill in for him when WFYR ended up switching to The Blaze, if you remember that.
Yeah, I remember that. Yes, I sure do.
Blaze.
Yeah.
Very hard rock station, and we had Major Tom up in the jet copter, and he wanted to take some time off, and I was able to come in and fill in for him, and it was an absolutely unbelievable experience, and it's so much different than, say, reporting news from the ground, because you literally just have a reporter's notebook. You're flying over expressways and tollways. You have your people back at command center, radioing you information. Go check this accident out, or to see if there's a delay here. At the same time, you're also speaking with the radio station, and you also have air traffic control and your pilot in your ear at the same time.
Right.
So
Yeah,
there's a lot of multitasking involved. So that started that, and then things started to roll for Metro as they ended up getting more and more stations. And I'm proud to say that I was one of the first, not the first by any stretch, but one of the first TV traffic reporters for Channel 5 back in 1992 when they switched from Shadow to Metro, and I was a part of First Thing in the Morning, which featured Bob Surratt and Allison Rosati at that time.
I'll be darned.
And I wasn't on camera. They just showed my maps, and you would hear me through audio that came in. And we had a good time with that because it was so different. And later on, when they went to Fox 32, well, Bob did, and then was with Marianne Murciano. I spent many years with them on the air as the traffic guy, and they would show up occasionally and have the camera in studio as well. But back to the aircraft. So since I had already had this experience, that's when they had me audition, because even if you worked there, you still had to audition for a station for WBBM. And eventually then I was doing traffic in the morning from the studio for Fox 32 and B96 with Eddie and Jobo, which I interned with both of those guys back in the mid-'80s when I was at Columbia. So I knew them, and Karen Hand as well. And incidentally, I work with Eddie now at Star 96.7, so we've been together a long, long time. But then I would get 9 o'clock. I would leave the Merchandise Mart downtown Chicago and drive to Palwaukee Airport, which is in the northwest suburbs, and then jump in a Cessna 172 with a certified flight instructor, and we would be on the air on the 8s from 10:08 to 1:38. I had 2 reports an hour at 8 and 38, unless something broke, and otherwise we flew around, and I actually got to fly quite a bit. I know, Rick, you have a background in flying and working with certified flight instructors. I was able to fly. My only regret is I didn't log any of those hours, which I probably should have.
Yeah.
They didn't tell me that. They weren't that smart,
it's
apparently.
pricey when you don't, let's just say.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I'm thinking about it now that I would have had, all those hours, and I could have applied those. I mean, we're up every day for 5 hours a day. I mean, I didn't fly constantly that time, but certainly that, as you said, does get pricey. So
yeah, it sure does. What was
so flying?
Go ahead.
As you had mentioned, if there was something kind of interesting, I was fortunate enough to be over many of the Bulls rallies that were downtown in Grant Park. And while that sounds exciting, when you're in a Cessna, you have to keep moving unlike a helicopter. So we would go round and round and round and round. I remember one year I was up with George Offman with the Score, and I was on BBM and he was on the Score, and we just kept circling and circling. He's like, "This is crazy." He goes, "I'm starting to get dizzy." I go, "Yep, there's not much we can do unless you want to stay here." So, and then one of the other incidents I remember covering was there was a really nasty train accident, which was in Northwest Indiana, and it involved a couple of passenger trains. The trains had what they called a gauntlet bridge. So you went from 2 tracks down to 1 to cross the bridge, and there was some sort of signaling issue, and they ended up colliding head on. It was a very, very nasty accident, and I was actually on CNN for that, which was interesting. So they had some coverage, and I actually did a live report on CNN. I don't have a copy of it, but I remember doing it. It was pretty fun, I got to say, despite, obviously, a very serious situation.
Right, yeah. That's amazing. Now, tell you what, gang, we're going to go ahead and give you the kind of Scott's roadmap of stations. I have the list, and I'll put that down to the show notes if you'd like to follow along. And before we continue with...
I'm going to write those down myself.
Okay, good. just click on the link, Scott. Just click on the link, okay? Now, before we continue, I hope you're enjoying the podcast. I thank you so much for tuning in, and let you know that we're on the web at SomeoneYouShouldKnowPodcast.com. There you're going to find our recent news, our archive of past episodes, and a whole lot more. By the way, if you're visiting, we invite you to go ahead and leave us a review. Let us know how we're doing. And we are just absolutely thrilled after just over a year. My goodness, we are now in over 1,700 cities worldwide, 80 countries. And we'd like to salute a couple of new stations, or new cities. Waukegan, Illinois, Claremore, Oklahoma, and The Villages, Florida. We thank you very much for tuning in. The Someone You Should Know podcast, heard wherever quality streaming audio is available. And now we're back to our interview with Scott Childers. Now, Scott is not only an on-air person and also a traffic reporter, he is also the historian for WLS. Scott, how did this all become? I know you had a website. Is that what started it all?
Do.
Yeah,
WLShistory.com. So this came about, as we had discussed earlier in the podcast, the WLS, like so many other people, were inspiration for getting into the radio and television industry overall, and just so many fans. When you think back in the days, back in the 1970s, where their Q, not only in the Chicagoland area, but across all of the United States, was incredible. I think it was somewhere at one point around 7 million that they were cuming when they went into a super Q across the country.
Mm-hmm. Especially at night, crazy. Boy, I'll tell you what, you could hear it down in Texas, you could hear it in Colorado, and I've heard a couple of people that you could hear it all the way out in California.
Thanks to the 50,000-watt blowtorch, that's true. And that's before some of the rules had changed, where Clear Channel stations, they had all the country to themselves. Right, and we're very fortunate here in Chicago to have several of those big boppers, 720 WGN, 780 WBBM, and WLS as well, where there was nothing else on those frequencies at all, and they could be heard all over the world, even at night. So, when I started getting into actually working as opposed to just being a radio listener, I remember Jeff Davis, who is a dear friend of mine now, and he was somebody that I certainly looked up to over the years. And he was always, even back before I was even on the air, back when I was in high school and in college, he was so instrumental because he was so good at fostering talent and encouraging people. Both him and Tommy Edwards are just absolutely amazing. And I love everybody that works there. Those two actually hold a little different, place in my heart because, they took some dumb kid who, wants to be on the radio under the wing and realized that I was serious. So one year, he puts together the 75th anniversary, and this was an expansive historical record that he put together from 1924 all the way up to, at that point, that was 96, I believe. No, that was 2001, wasn't it? Yeah. As I said, my math is not always that good.
You're a radio guy.
So it aired on the radio station, and he did all of these interviews with not only the people that have been there during the music radio era and the talk era, but also people that like Andy Williams, who spent time on the radio station, and found some archival footage from people like George Goebel and some of the early pioneers of the radio station, and put this wonderful, wonderful thing together. And I thought, I'm surprised that nobody has done this on the web, on the internet at that point. And I had a few things of my own, being a collector, nothing, that was anywhere close to what he had. But I kind of started to build it from there and retold the story in that case. And that's how we ended up with the WLS History website. And it's strange, is once I put it together, the doors it opened, because once somebody, people would see that and they go, oh, this is actually not just a tribute, it's actually a credible chronology of the radio station. And I would hear from people that I would never expect to have heard from, both from the history of the station, announcers, disc jockeys from the 60s that I didn't know personally at that point, say like Art Roberts or Dex Card back in the day, Ron Riley, and but also from people who remembered that their grandmother or their great aunt was on the Dinner Bell show at noon in 1942 and wondered if we had some audio, which of course we didn't. But just gave these great recollections of it. And it just kind of grew from there. And while nowadays we see so many tribute sites and lots on Facebook, it still holds up as, I think, the original. And I still maintain it, not as much as I would like to sometimes. But, the nice thing is history doesn't change. So as long as you can keep up on the front end, the back end pretty much stays okay, unless I end up getting some additional information, or perhaps I get better information or find better pictures or whatever it is. So, but otherwise, it is a historical record, and the radio station was completely fine with it because they weren't going to do it. I wasn't charging for it. I wasn't using it for any sort of a vehicle to sell anything. So they were completely fine and continue to be fine with it.
Very good. WLShistory.com if you want to check it out. And here's something else I want you all to check out. This is you see them over there at your bookstores. It's the Images of America series. And this one is Chicago WLS Radio. This is a fascinating book. If you grew up listening to WLS either in the Chicago area or countrywide, this is fascinating information because it goes from the very inception of it through I guess it's like 2007, 2008. Scott?
Yeah, it essentially went up to about the time of the when we did the WLS Rewind.
Yeah.
Because, the book came out in 2008. So about 2007 was about the latest thing that's in the book.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. In doing your research for this, Scott, is there something that you didn't know about WLS that kind of is like, oh, I didn't know that?
Well, it's funny, Rick, because it kind of goes back to doing the history pages and finding out all that happened before the rock and roll era. Most people who are either fans of the station or fans of rock and roll and Chicago radio certainly know about the music radio era from 1960 to 1989. But what went on before 1960? Some people, I think it was a country station, or Sears owned it, and maybe they used it to sell washing machines or something like that. And I didn't really know a lot about it because, quite honestly, it was before my time to begin with. And when I started digging into this and how the station was formed, number one, and its years as the Prairie Farmer Station are absolutely legendary. So the station went on the air in 1924, and it was a product of Sears. Sears put it on the air because they felt they wanted to use it as a goodwill service to the farmer. And they did soft sell. In other words, they didn't really talk about the catalog. They didn't talk about Sears all that much. They talked about the farmer, but farmers were smart. They would get the Sears catalog, and they realized that, the same people who we're talking to, I can purchase these items from. So that's really how it got started. And the very first week is when the WLS National Barn Dance went on the air.
Absolutely.
And this was an interesting story because what I had learned was the first week they put it on the air. Executives from Sears felt it was very lowbrow entertainment and at first fighted to take it off the air, but it became so popular to begin with. And the person that put that on the air was a guy by the name, his name is George Dewey Hay, but he went as the Solemn Old Judge. That was his name on the radio.
Okay.
However, he was hardly an old guy. He was only about 25 years old. He started the National Barn Dance here, and then later on, several months later, left WLS, went to Nashville, and he was the one that started the Grand Ole Opry.
Wow, that is incredible. What a great story. What a great story. You know, one thing really kind of surprised me in the book is if you look at radio stations nowadays, they're usually thrown in some kind of strip mall. They're really scaled down. Back in the days when WLS was doing the old country shows on at 1230 West Washington Boulevard, the size of the radio station with all the different broadcast studios, because you were doing live music back during those days and such. And it just dumbfounded me on how large that was, because I can't think of the last time I've been in a radio station that was bigger than, I don't know, maybe the size of a trailer.
And only one radio station.
And only one radio station, yeah, because usually it's a group of 4 or 5 stations or whatever. And it's just amazing. That kind of dumbfounded me. I want people to get copies of this book for Christmas for the WLS radio lover on your list. And as a matter of fact, down in the notes, I'm going to tell you exactly where you can get this thing. It's the Images of America, Chicago's WLS Radio, and Scott and I would like for you to buy a couple hundred copies for Christmas, okay? Because Scott's kicking me back 10%. There you go. You mentioned this just briefly, but I wanted to talk about that too. Back in 2007 and 2008, during Memorial Day weekend, you did a WLS Rewind that I absolutely love. It's one of my treasured possessions. I have a copy of it, of all the hours of all the jocks. And I just absolutely love it. What do you remember from those days, man?
Well, that is definitely the brainchild of Kipper McGee, longtime program director at WLS and programmer around the country as well, originally based in Milwaukee. And he is also the one that has a very great series now, which is called Brandwidth. He has a book out called Brandwidth, and he has pretty much a consulting firm that works on that. And not just radio, but I mean, all brands, because he realized that really branding is so important to whatever you're selling, whether it's radio or if you're selling a coffee cup, you need to figure out what your brand is. And Kipper was the one that put that together. The radio station was just about ready to be sold from ABC to, at that point, Citadel. And when you have talk radio stations, when you get to holidays, whether it's a Labor Day or in this case, a Memorial Day, a lot of the listenership goes down. Your live talk hosts aren't generally working, and the syndicated shows you have on are usually going to be reruns. And he thought a great idea would be to bring back the glory days of the Big 89 from pretty much essentially the 70s and 80s was where he was focused on as far as that's concerned. And while it was awesome for listeners that remembered it, this is the genius of Kipper. He realized that most of the people that listened to WLS talk radio were of about that same age. And if they had not listened, this would give them a great chance to sample the radio station. And that was the reason that he was able to sell it to corporate, and that all of the jocks came back to do it. And we put the music together. We had so many people that helped out, and it was unbelievable. Larry Lujak, the first year, was still at his home in Santa Fe, but Tommy was here. We had Jeff Davis. We also had John Records Landecker, which was an absolute scream to work with him and to run the board for Boogie Check and all the other fun stuff we did. And in addition to it being a audio record, our friend, radio's best friend, Art Volo, recorded just about everything to capture that. So we did it the 1 year, and then we ended up doing it the year after as well. And then at that point, the station changed hands, and Kipper had moved on, and that was pretty much it. But it was like being in the eye of the storm, actually, because we had heard just how crazy everybody was over this thing, but we were kind of insulated inside the building, and it wasn't until after that we heard the stories of just how great it was. And to listen back to it, it is absolutely amazing.
I totally agree with you, I absolutely love those. Those are some of my favorite, I would say tapes, but it's now MP3s. I enjoy watching it. By the way, one of my dearest friends helped you on that, Jay Philpott. Jay helped you that
Yes, Jay
day.
was very instrumental in that as well, and Bill Shannon, and we had Michael Garay, who still works at WLS. He actually is a friend of mine that I've known since college days, and he started there as his first job, and he's still executive producer and works with Steve Cochran now. He comes with the building, and it's been several buildings actually at this point. So, because he was there at 360, then he was there when they moved in with Channel 7 to the ABC building, and now over the NBC Tower. And he was also very instrumental. We got very lucky when those went off. We were still in the Channel 7 building, and I had come in that weekend before to kind of help him out and get some tapes together, brought him some things he needed, material, music. We were looking for edited songs that WLS would play. For example, say "Carry On Wayward Son." We all know the original version, a little over 5 minutes, but obviously back in those days, the AM stations played the ones that were probably about 3:50, 3:30. So I had a few of those, and then the ones I didn't have, I went back and listened to and re-edited them. So I brought all that in, and we started digging around in the storeroom just to see what we could find and see if there was anything fun that didn't get thrown out, because like every other radio station in this country, when you need storage room or you need space for something else, something has to go. And unfortunately, WLS, as many other radio stations over the years, have been victims of throwing out their history. And some of it's been saved, and some of it has not made it. And those are stories we can do for another day, because there's a lot of interesting stories from that. So we were digging around, and we happened to find a couple of boxes, and they were of the shape, of a record cover, So you knew that it's like kind of that 12 by 12. And we opened it up, and lo and behold, we found 2 boxes of new old stock of Animal Stories albums.
Oh, dear God, I love that.
And who knows how long they'd been sitting there, probably from 1982 or 1983. And we ended up giving those away on the air because we ended up finding, they were still in shrink wrap. They had not been opened. And it was perfect timing, because somebody else probably would have found them and said, just dump that. We need to make room for another file cabinet.
Jeez, yeah. I know you've got to get on the air in a couple of minutes here, so I'm going to go ahead and kind of move down just a little bit here. We all have interesting stories of one thing or another being on the radio. Radio brothers, radios and sisters all have one thing in common, and that is a remote from hell. What would you say would be your remote from hell, Scott?
I've been very fortunate over the years, and, for those who don't understand remote, so a remote is where we would go out and do a live broadcast, whether it was for a couple hours, maybe at the local car dealer, or, we're over at the Lazy Boy showcase shop. I did plenty of those over my career. Spent a lot of time at Meyer, also a lot of remotes there, too. And the way that we've done these have changed so much. When I was working at 100.3 Windy 100 FM, and even prior to that, when it was The Point, we would do remotes, and we just use a phone. And nowadays that seems almost unheard of. When you think of how the technology has changed, and technology is great, but sometimes technology brings its baggage with. Case in point, it wasn't my remote, but it was my morning show guy and program director for 1340 WJOL, which is a talk station in Joliet, Scott Slocum, who's the program director. He was doing a live sports show. It was just before the Final Four. So he was set up with some of the other sports guys that are play-by-play for some of the high school football and basketball, and they were at a local bar. So I was not there to run it. We had a promotions assistant there to set everything up, and lo and behold, it was 5 minutes before it went on the air, and nothing was working properly. So I was supposed to go out to dinner with my wife and her sister, and I got the call, and I actually drove right past the restaurant and continued on to the remote site. So they had no internet, or their internet was not working right, and they were using a system that was kind of old. I had a few ideas on some new systems we could use, so I got everything all set up and ready to go. Of course, at that point, when you're not on the air, you're not doing what you're supposed to, everybody just stands there and stares at you because, like, when are we going to get this going? So this codec that I purchased was actually from the Netherlands. So I got it set up, and I put in my credit card information, and the charge card company denied it because you're trying to make a purchase to the Netherlands from Northern Illinois on a Tuesday night at 7:15. Something doesn't sound right.
Absolutely.
And I need to get this thing on the air. So I go take another card out, and I try that one. Nope, that one was denied as well. So finally, I think it was my American Express card that finally went through. We got it going. It took us probably about 20 minutes, but we ended up getting everything on the air. But it took quite a while, and the thing is that a lot of people that are on the other side of the speaker have no idea all the crazy things that go on to get this stuff to work.
It floors me sometimes, especially when my former boss, I'm not going to name names, but he was into modern technology, and he would assure us that this would work and everything, and all of a sudden we get out there and realize we don't have a hotspot. Or, it's like they don't have internet, or we can't use their internet for whatever reason or something like that. It's like, okay, we can't log in. What do you think we should do? Okay, do you have it on your phone? Yeah. Well, just go ahead and make your
Rick,
phone
it's
a
funny
hotspot.
you mentioned that, because that same remote, you just reminded me that they couldn't get into, they had Wi-Fi, but none of the support staff at the restaurant, none of the servers or anyone, they had no idea what the password was. So I ended up having to do the same thing. I ended up using my phone, and as a result, instead of going to dinner elsewhere, I spent the next 3 hours there because my phone was tethered in so that they could get the broadcast off.
Absolutely. Tell you what, final thoughts here. Let's go ahead and link your socials. Where can people find out more information about Scott Childers, all the stations you're at, everything that you're on? What would be the best place to find that, Scott?
That would be ScottChilders.com, ScottChilders.com, or you could also try ScottOnAir.com, which is just a shortcut link. And then, yes, I'm on Facebook and on Instagram. I have a Twitter account, but I don't use it all that much. But there is the YouTube account, which does have a lot of interesting videos, and those are definitely linked from the ScottChilders.com site as well.
Very good. Scott, what about your online radio station, too? Internet radio station?
So here's an interesting thing. Yes, we play radio all the time for real, and it's still not enough. And then several of us in the business decide, well, let's also have some fun playing radio on the side. And I started this probably back in the late 90s, and I had it on the air, online, I should say, for quite some time. I just started it as a small station at home. It was almost an extension, Rick, of what we were talking about playing radio prior to that. And radio automation had started to mature at that point, so you didn't have to sit there and actually push the button for the next song. And that's kind of what really got me interested in doing that. So I had that on for many years, and I ran it in the house on a little 100 milliwatt transmitter that you could purchase and build back in those days. And had it on for some time, and then what had happened was that the licensing, the royalties got to be too expensive. So I took it off from a public IP address, and I just had it for myself in the background. And then about a year ago, I was at the NAB, and I was talking to them about that, and we put it back on the air, and it's 92.1 the X. And the reason it came up with X is I'm a ham radio operator, and my original call had an X in it, and I just decided I'd use that.
There you go.
But it's not an alternative station by any stretch. It is pretty much hit music from the 70s, 80s, all the way through today. And our slogan is hot hits and cool tunes. And it's fun to have it back on the air, and everyone's welcome to take a listen to it. 921thex.com. And somebody asked me one time, well, what's the X stand for? And I said, well, at the time, W and Z were already taken.
Ah, there you go. I'm going to let you go. Scott, thanks so much for tuning in or being a part of the Someone You Should Know podcast. We really do appreciate it, and it's always fun to talk to radio brothers and sisters.
Rick, thank you for the opportunity and continued success. I am so glad that it's going so well. And it's reason, number one, because of you, and also because you have such great guests, and continued success. And I look forward to coming back sometime soon.
Thank you, brother. God bless you, buddy.
Take care. Thank you, sir.
Hi, this is Rick Anthony, thanking you again for listening to this episode of Someone You Should Know. Now, if you're an aspiring musician or an established musician that's looking for a little exposure, I invite you to drop us a line at someoneyoushouldknowpodcast@gmail.com. That's someoneyoushouldknowpodcast@gmail.com. Also, I invite you to tell a friend about the Someone You Should Know podcast. I thank you for tuning in this time, and I invite you to check us out next time on the Someone You Should Know podcast, because you never know who's going to show up. Until next time, remember, God loves you, and so do I.